Hello, everyone, and welcome to a special installment of City Lights Live, the virtual extension of the City Lights events calendar. I'm your host, Peter Maravellis. With us today, we are delighted to have with us award-winning historian Mark Braude discussing his book, Kiki Man Ray, Art, Love, and Rivalry in 1920s Paris. It's published by W. Norton, and it charts the volatile relationship between Kiki de Montparnasse and the surrealist photographer Man Ray. Kiki captivated audiences as a nightclub performer in 1920s Paris. She met Man Ray in 1921 during a chance encounter at a cafe. What followed was an explosive decade-long relationship, both professional and romantic, during which the couple grew and experimented as artists competing for fame in 1920s Paris, and really creating some of the most shocking and interesting images that really cemented Man Ray's reputation as one of the great artists of the modern era. While Man Ray's legacy endured, Kiki's has become more of a footnote in the annals of bohemian Paris. Now, the book Kiki Man Ray illuminates for the first time Kiki's seminal influence, not only on Man Ray, but on the culture of 1920s Paris and beyond. It's the story of an exceptional life that will really challenge ideas about artists and muses and the lines separating the two. As is customary at the outset of each event, I'd like to acknowledge that this broadcast is originating on the ancestral homelands of the Ramaytush peoples. I would like to take this moment to pay respect to those who have come before us as stewards of the land. Mark Braude teaches history and urban studies at Stanford University. He holds a PhD in history from the University of Southern California and a master's in French studies from New York University. He's been a columnist for the Globe and the Mail and has written for the Daily Beast and other publications. He's the author of Making Monte Carlo, A History of Speculation and Spectacle. He'll be joined today in conversation by Prudence Peiffer. Prudence Peiffer is an art historian, writer, and editor specializing in modern and contemporary art. She's the director of content at Museum of Modern Art in New York. She serves as senior editor at Art Forum magazine and has worked there from 2012 through 2017. And also digital content director at David Zwirner in 2018. She is the author of the book, The Slip, the New York City Street That Changed American Art Forever, which was longlisted for the National Book Award in nonfiction. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, the New York Review of Books, Art Forum, and other publications. So we've posted links in the event description with which you may purchase copies of the new paperback edition of Kiki Man Ray. So we are delighted to welcome now Mark Braude and Prudence Peiffer. Such a pleasure to have you both with us today. Welcome to City Lights.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you to both of you. I've been looking forward to it. Thank you, Prudence, again.
Thank you. Can we jump right in, Mark?
Yeah.
Okay. You've written a really beautiful and evocative book. And as someone also compelled by thinking about the influence of place and a community of artists on each other, I really love this book. And it kind of has it all, as the subtitle suggests. It's fun and funny. It's packed with amazing anecdotes and encounters. It's also quite poignant. I mean, I found it quite sad as well at times. And as Peter just said, now it's available in paperback, which is really wonderful because you can now carry it with you anywhere easily. And obviously, one's first choice for travel would be to take it to Paris, but I think it would be good company anywhere you were to go. So for those readers lucky enough to not have read this book yet, to not have had that pleasure and to still have that pleasure ahead of them, I wonder if you could first just let us know a little bit about what drew you to this story of Kiki de Montparnasse and Bohemian Paris. Why her?
That's a great start because it all really started with ignorance, my own ignorance as a teacher. Peter mentioned me teaching at Stanford. That's actually in the past tense. I haven't been there since 2017, but was very honored to be there as a postdoc and then as a lecturer. And while teaching there, I did modern art, I did modern Paris, fashion, all sorts of courses revolving around this moment in the 20th century and specifically in Paris and France. I would often be talking about Man Ray's iconic photograph of a woman who's seated with her back to the camera, and her back has been marked up with the F holes of a violin or a cello so that her body looks like an instrument. It's called Le Violon d'Angle. It's from 1924, Angle's violin. And it was always a way for me to talk about Man Ray and surrealism. and sort of all of the new art that was, and writing and ideas that were coming out of Paris in the 20s. And about the woman in the picture, I would say her name was Kiki de Montparnasse. She was the most sought after artist model of that era in Paris, and was said to be romantically linked to Man Ray during the time when they made this picture. That's all I would say, because it's all I knew. And I would pass that along to the students. And it got to bugging me that I didn't know more about her. And especially because it seemed there was something about her presence in that particular picture that really lent to its allure, to its magic, a century later, even though we only see her in profile. So just for the sake of a better lecture, I was like, well, let's learn more about Kiki de Montparnasse. And as I started digging, I found out within days, I had the whole story wrong. I was totally backward. First of all, modeling was probably among the least, let's say, far from the most interesting or important or influential thing she did in Paris in the 20s. And also that when that picture was made in 1924, that I had been selling as this iconic Man Ray work, when they made it, and the few hundred people in Paris who first saw it in this surrealist little magazine, would have thought of that image as, there's our icon, Kiki de Montparnasse, who's been caught on film by her boyfriend, this American man who's just starting out as a photographer. She was by far the more influential figure in Paris at that time, and she did so many things which I discovered in the course of my research, and that became the basis of a multi-page book. I don't know what it's at, probably 300 pages or something, about the two of them, but mostly with her as the star, and I think rightly so.
One of the things I really love about the book is how you kind of set the stage and the scene of 1920s Paris. And could you tell us a little bit more about what it was like in artistic circles there, and why sort of Montparnasse as this sort of central site that brought together artists and writers and composers and so many different kinds of creative people?
Well, I'm honored to be asked that question by you, because the slip your recent book is so amazing at evoking scene and arguing for the importance of scene and setting and physical space in the creation of art, which I think is a really cool and fun way of looking at our history, cultural history. And everyone should go check out The Slip, because it's a great book. For me, what I loved about, Paris in the 20s, it's sort of well-worn territory. What I liked about Kiki's version of it, a woman named, born Alice Plain in the provinces in 1901, south east of Paris, about 3 hours now by car, in a very agrarian setting, comes to the big city as a teenager and really makes it her own, and gives us a view of Paris in the 20s that is often overlooked in the, roaring 20s Americans in Paris literature, which is the version of a French person and a French woman. And we forget sometimes how vital the locals were to the scene, and that a lot of the people who had come there, people like the Hemingways and the Fitzgeralds, were drawn in part not just by the scenery and the museums and all the rest, but by these people, the French people and the ways of living that they were experiencing and putting out. And Kiki had this really interesting energy about her, and really caught the spirit of her age in a weird and interesting way, I thought. But what I was trying to get at with this Paris of Montparnasse, Kiki and Man Ray's Paris, was that they're sort of making it up as they go along, right? You forget that sometimes. Hemingway is a cottage industry. Picasso is, his name is on the back of, I think, Renaults or Citroens at this point. These are, we see them in the galleries, and these are giant draws. At the time, they're just kids, right? They're like in their 20s. Man Ray was 30. Kiki was 20 when they first met. They're hanging out in like apartments, having parties, sharing drinks, sharing ideas, sharing cigarettes. And they all live, a few doors down from one another. And no one's really thinking about, certainly not legend or millions of dollars. They're just, they're trying, certainly they want to express themselves. They want to get recognized for that, but they're really trying to get enough to eat and sharing openly in ideas. And that's why there's so much cross-pollination.
Yeah.
They're all sort of doing different things at once. Man Ray thinks of himself as a painter in the 1920s, right? And actually all through his life, I think, really identified as a painter. And it's with Kiki, when they get together and she starts modeling for him, that he starts to really get comfortable with the camera and starts to do portraits for work, professional portraits for pay, and these more avant-garde portraits with Kiki, and discovers that medium. And she too is, we can get into, a little later, is also doing a whole bunch of different things at once. She's expressing herself in a whole bunch of different ways. And they all are. Man Ray taught Brancusi about photography. Brancusi, I'm mangling his name, brought Man Ray into the studio and showed him about sculpture, which I think probably helped his own work. So there's a lot of that. I guess that's what I was going for in my version of 20s Paris. Was I really wanted to remind people about how sort of made up it was, how not set in stone any of the ideas or identities were. And then the last thing I'll say in this rambling answer is that I wanted to remind people of what I thought was quite important fact about 1920s Paris was, it's not coincidental that became this white hot center for so many new ideas and new ways of looking at the world, because it was, I think, the most cosmopolitan and open place on earth at that point for that decade, which is not to, deny that the French could be xenophobic and that there were all sorts of terrible things that went on in that decade in regards to outsiders and immigrants. But for that time and place, that era in the world, I think it was especially in Montparnasse, this little neighborhood, a very, very open place for people who felt sort of stifled or rejected or denigrated in their own homelands, could come if they had the means, or were pushed out or whatever brought them there, could live more openly than they could at home. And I think that those, correlation between an openness, a cosmopolitanism, and a new outlook on art and life are not sort of inseparable. I think they're totally intertwined.
Yeah. And you mentioned Ernest Hemingway, and your book has lots of amazing cameos of, names both that are easily recognizable and less known, that have sort of fallen through the cracks of history in a way, which you helped kind of bring their names back and forward. And Hemingway, I believe, ends up writing a introduction for Kiki's memoirs. You mentioned that she really, was incredibly creatively productive, and your book helps us understand all the different kinds of projects she was involved in. And one of her amazing things that she did was she wrote these memoirs that I'm sure were really interesting and compelling for you in writing the book. And he called her memoirs a damned fine, extraordinary book, which, if you're going to have a Hemingway blurb on the back of your book, that's a good one. But you also uncovered so much about Kiki's early life, which you mentioned, when she went by, I won't even try to pronounce it in the nice French way, Alice. And I'm just curious how you came upon some of these stories and these materials. If you could just sort of talk to us a little bit about your research for the book, because as a nerd in that way, I always find it really fascinating to hear how an author kind of comes upon their material, and if there were any kind of serendipitous finds in the archives for you.
Yeah, it was all serendipity. It was all one archive, one piece led to another. And that's why I got to see such a kaleidoscopic view of Kiki. And maybe this is a great way to enter into a discussion of what she actually did.
Yeah.
Before we get to, and then the Hemingway intro of her memoir sort of ties it up. So she started in my mind as this artist model, and that is indeed how she got entry into the art world of Paris. She was somebody, as I said, born very poor, illegitimate, obscure, in the provinces, and came to the city as a teenager and worked a bunch of menial jobs, a lot of them related to the war effort. The Great War was on, so she was like oiling dead soldiers' boots to be put back into rotation. Her longest job was at a bakery, and then she lost that job because she had marked her eyebrows up with some burnt matchstick, and the baker's wife called her what we would translate as a little tart, and so she punched the baker's wife and lost that job. And that got her, in fact, on her way toward what she really wanted to do, because a sculptor who had been a regular at the bakery, heard her sad story about having no work and said, "You can come pose for me." And she ended up really liking that work, and it paid well, and she found it easy, and it got her in the orbit of art and artists, which was really where she wanted to be. She didn't quite know how or what or why, but she knew that she wanted an artistic life. And from there, she started to pose for everyone from Modigliani to Fujita to Chaim Soutine, Moise Kisling. Alexander Calder did a beautiful wire sculpture of her, emphasizing her big pointy nose, which she was very proud of. And from there, she starts singing at a nightclub called the Jockey, this is all happening in Montparnasse, and was really quite dazzling and quite modern in her performance. She was sort of a retro act in a way. She did this Belle Epoque version of what they called the diseuses, which is sort of like the sayers, I guess is how it would translate. Sort of talking and singing and joking and playing with her shawl and doing winks and all sorts of stuff as she's telling the stories of these songs. And really great at deadpan humor. She would sing about a thug or somebody who'd been like, their belly had been sliced open by a thug and they're waiting for the ambulance and they've taped up their guts with some like adhesive tape. And they're singing about, they're telling the story as they're waiting for the ambulance. And she would deliver that in this really like detached, deadpan way, almost like Gabriel Garcia Marquez writes about these outstanding, astounding things in this very straight language. And there's a pleasure in that sort of. People ate it up. I mean, it was really, really, as I said, kind of retro, but also very, very modern and very new. And people hadn't really seen it before. And she became this huge attraction in Paris. And now this is like 24, 25. She's a kid. I don't mean to say she's a kid. To me, she's a kid. She was in her 20s, right? She's an adult, but she was young. And it's all happening quite quickly. And from there, she started to paint, which she'd always done for fun. And she started to actually show her paintings. She sold out the debut of her gallery show, 27 paintings. And, a collector at the time compared her to Matisse. I mean, she was, I don't know if she was a great painter, but she was, she was doing some cool stuff. And she starts appearing in films, both commercial and avant-garde, usually playing some version of herself, an artist model or a muse, to use that term, in some way or another. And all of this is really, especially her cabaret performances, she's telling a story of herself. She's invented this character, Kiki de Montparnasse, this larger than life version of herself. In truth, she was very shy. We would say today she had social anxiety. She got panic attacks going to new places. But on stage, she was this very sexual, very outgoing, ultimate Parisian sophisticate, but also a kind of country bumpkin. She used to play that up. She used to roll her R's in this very rural way and use a lot of slang that the Parisians and people in Paris really thought was quite, enjoyable. And so she has this character of Kiki, and she puts it out there in Paris. And this is why I think she's really important in so many different ways. So she paints these portraits of herself. She's posing for everybody else as Kiki. She's on stage as Kiki. She's in film as Kiki. And then most importantly, I think, and to get back eventually now to your question, she puts out these memoirs in 1929 in French, 1930 in English. And they're really a life story, and a lot of it about her childhood. By the time it's published, she's like 30, but she's telling her whole life story. And it was truly a sensation in Paris. That's not an exaggeration. It was front page of the major newspapers in the city, Le Temps, Le Figaro, who all took her very seriously as a writer. She had these very short declarative Hemingway sentences. And yes, indeed, for the English translation put out by an American in Paris named Edward Titus, Hemingway wrote the introduction. They were friends, I think, Hemingway and Kiki. But as you said, he genuinely praised her writing, which he doesn't do a lot. And he only wrote 2 intros to books in his whole career. One was for Kiki and one for a bartender from Montparnasse. And yeah, he brings up E.E. Cummings. He brings up Virginia Woolf in talking about her. And what the book did, it's a short little book, it's maybe like 50 pages, is it was one more version of self-invention, presentation, as the ultimate insider to this tribe of bohemians in Montparnasse. And the papers, the critics in the papers really saw her as like an ethnographer. And they said, she's really insightful as an ethnographer. She was really good at like sizing people up in a couple sentences. And she gave versions of this community and its players to the public, you know, a kind of like, look what's going on here behind the scene, and very loving, very tender. And I think the thing that people responded to was showed that in this artistic community, and again, to bring it back to you in the slip, there was a lot of love and a lot of care, people taking care of financially and emotionally and all the rest of one another. And that's how we got so much of what we got, was because there was like real love in this little community.
Well, speaking about love and the loss of love, one, I love the title of this book, and it has this very clever, ambiguous lack of syntax, I guess, in that, you know, it's Kiki Man Ray. There's no colon, there's no comma, there's no slash. You talk about in the book that sometimes, I don't remember if she would introduce herself as that or friends would refer to her as that, because it was almost like the two of them, you know, they were partners. And could you talk a little bit about the sort of the very clever work that your title is doing in terms of the relationship between Kiki and Man Ray?
Sure. And here's where we say poor Man Ray, because I've actually barely mentioned him, and yet half of this book and has his own really, I think, fascinating story as the child of Russian and Jewish immigrants to Brooklyn, and then goes to Paris to really thinking he's going to be there for 3 months and ends up staying for essentially 50 years, with a few years taken away for the Second World War. And truly, I think, a genius and brilliant and troubled and destructive and violent and horrible, but also, you know, compelling. So the title is, as you say, sort of the name that Kiki, one of the very many names that Kiki went by in Paris. When she was on screen and was credited, some of her credits read as Kiki Ray or Kiki Man Ray. They were never married. They were together romantically and lived together from about 1921 to 1928 or 29. Very volatile, up and down relationship. But she did see them as fused in a way, as a single being. And her friends, their friends, called her Kiki Ray and Kiki Man Ray in letters. So that sort of like, I knew I could sort of make that case that that's how she was identified in some circles. But it also, as you say, there's a play of like, well, could it be Kiki / Man Ray, Kiki, Man Ray? And that is one of the things I wanted to allude to. And the bigger question or argument, if there is one in this book, is about those lines. And Peter mentioned this in his intro, the lines between the artist and the muse, so-called, and to kind of complicate and challenge those two categories. I think, yes, Kiki was Man Ray's muse in a very traditional sense. You know, he was charmed by her, he was seduced by her, he was inspired by her physicality, by her humor, by her personality, and as a sort of physical thing to look at and represent in various media, she played that role for him. She was his model, okay? In hundreds, thousands, like maybe, of black and white images, moving images, and he painted her quite beautifully. However, I was way more interested in how she was, let's say, a muse or a source of inspiration as a rival. And rivalry is one of the subtitles of the book. I think she drove him nuts through her own artistic pursuits, because she did so many things freely without really, and I say this honestly and not to try and denigrate her, and I think it comes through from the research and what I know about her and reading her own words. I don't think she was that hung up on money or fame or ambition. I think she wanted to live a life of pleasure and excitement and travel and food and sex and wine, and to express herself. And she did that through her art without really seeking reward, it seems to me. And I think that drove Man Ray nuts, because he was always trying to be free in his art and wrote all about freedom and the freedom of the artist. And yet he wasn't free in the way she was, because he was always hung up on money, and he became extremely successful and very wealthy, but not free in the way Kiki was. And I think that he tried to diminish her work. In his own memoirs, he writes very almost in the passive voice about her work, as if things had happened to her and fallen into her lap, and also that her art making was a way to sort of kill time. I think he kind of makes those references, that she did it out of boredom, which is so not true. And so I liked this idea of like, yes, she did push him to new work, and he pushed her, I think, as well to new work, but it was as much in those sort of traditional ways as in really interpersonal ways of this rivalry, this anger.
Well, something that both you and Peter have alluded to now is this idea of the muse. And I really love how your book complicates that relationship that's sort of, been typically understood in art history in a very gendered direction of a sort of beautiful or mysterious woman who's inspiring the genius of this male artist. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the kind of paths of influence that you explore in the book, not just in centering Kiki's story, which is so important, and her creative practice, which I think is very underknown, but also one thing that I found really fascinating, and hopefully it's not giving away too much of the, amazing things to discover in the book, but is how you suggest we might actually look at Man Ray's photographs differently, kind of knowing more about their relationship.
Sure. So, and I didn't get quite to answer your question about the process, and this is sort of a good way to start, is that the previous question, a lot of it was obviously the memoirs from Man Ray and from Kiki, and then the obvious things, the photos and all the works themselves. We have a bit of her on record and on film. It's not much, but also a lot of press coverage. And so an interesting way to get into what you're talking about here is there was a Juna Barnes piece from 1924 about models in Paris for some American magazine, I can't remember which. Man Ray actually provides the image, the photo, and Juna Barnes the words, and it's about this sort of new breed of model in Paris and what they're doing. And Juna uses Kiki as a prime example, and she's saying the model or muse in the past was praised for her beauty and all of the traditional things that you're getting at. And now we have this time where the surrealists especially are as interested or as sort of galvanized by personality. The more mischievous and unsettling, the better. And she gives these examples of Kiki as this really wild anarchic energy that is inspiring all of these men, really, all male artists, in the Barnes piece, to create new works. And that gets at a larger theme in the book of when you talk about these creations of the iconic Man Ray photos of Kiki. I was trying to, let's say, destabilize them or look at them in different ways that I came to genuinely now from having a little bit more knowledge about their relationship, as could we look at them as collaborations of a sort? So if you look at that Le Violon d'Ingres, the iconic women as cello photo, or an equally well-known one titled Noir et Blanche, black and white, of Kiki holding a mask from the Ivory Coast with her eyes closed. They're, to my eye, and again, now biased because of reading about them and learning about them, to my eye, they're pieces of theater. Kiki, we have to remember, is a performer. She's a cabaret presence. She really has stage presence. And she would talk about how on the stage, she's like a conductor of a train. She feels completely in command and is telling stories and is interacting with the crowd and sort of pausing to get people to like heighten anticipation, and is calling people out when they're talking, and is joking and is flirting and is doing a million different things with absolute presence and command, and also on film. And I like now to think of those images, and a lot of the images they did together that are less well-known and more exploratory, we could say, where they're sort of learning the camera and she's learning the pose and they're both learning the medium together, as these little pieces of performance. The lighting and composition are all vital, of course, but I think that there is this moment of, it's a play between the sitter and the photographer. And it's very easy, you know, nobody wrote like, on that day I did exactly XYZ, and Man Ray says, on that day I did, we don't have that. And it's way more simple to just say, well, Man Ray's the one with the camera, so he was the one calling the shots. He captured something of Kiki, and done. But, you know, there's another way of looking at it, of saying, did she, you know, is this her performance of this character for this recording lens that Man Ray has then now kind of just been there to capture, in a sense? And isn't he lucky? It's not one or the other, but I like that there's somewhere in between that can really get at something new and try to explore that magic of the play between the two of them. And isn't that way more interesting than a just, you know, a more simple reading? I'm not saying it's, you know, I'm 100% right or wrong, but I like to think of it as a more collaborative.
Absolutely.
Project.
And I do feel like the evidence really builds through the book, so that you do come, you know, I think you revisit that at the very end of the book. And, you know, in that moment, I think your reader is really there with you, and seeing things anew. It's a really kind of exciting moment in terms of even, you know, art history and how we think about our history. And in another interview that you gave for this book, you mentioned some, to me, sort of slightly unexpected influences of other books, and just in terms of maybe the vibe of them, including Patti Smith's Just Kids and Sally Rooney's Normal People, two books that I really loved. And actually Just Kids was also really a touchstone for me in thinking about the slip. And it's funny because you've used that expression a little bit even today in our interview, in terms of kind of reminding us of how young the artists and, you know, writers were in this moment in Paris, and, you know, just really starting out, and that it's important to kind of ground the story. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about, you know, how, well, it's also just interesting to me when authors talk about sort of farther flung literature that makes its way even as a vibe or a kind of texture into a book. So I would just love to hear a little bit more about, you know, why those books, and if anything else, you know, that you were kind of reading at the time or thinking about helped to inform your approach and, you know, how you wanted the book to be.
Yeah, it's sort of dangerous in the sense to say that you know, this memoir that was experienced by a person, by Patti Smith and Robert Mapplethorpe, could somehow inform a work of history. But it really did, in a sense, without trying to be overdetermined. I really saw that in describing her own life with Mapplethorpe, she was always keen to bring in the bigger picture of their time and place, their friends, and again, this very kind of tangential nature of it all, of like that they're sort of just kids. It's right there in the title, right? They're coming into their being without knowing that they're going to become these two legends. And I thought that's important, to be able to go back into child's mind, let's say, to borrow a term. When you're looking at history, you got to forget everything that happens afterward, and let's get back to the root of it and look at it as they were on that day, let's say in 1924. So from that point of view, her approach was very informative for me, and it's a fabulous book, and everyone should read it. It's lovely. And then the Sally Rooney is also really interesting. You know, you'd think has nothing to do with this, but I believe every single scene in that book is in some way the two main characters. I think it's Connell and Marianne, if I've got it right. I might have it wrong, but those two main characters are in some way interacting. Even if they're not in the same place, almost every single bit of that book has some, you know, they're butting up against one another in some way. And that sounds simple, but it's hard to do as a historian. You're beholden to the facts and to the archives, but I really wanted to highlight any time Man Ray, and again, it sounds so simple to say, but it was hard to do. Anytime Man Ray and Kiki are in the same place at the same time, that is gold. Okay, I need them always to be interacting, and where do they start at the beginning of this interaction? Where do they end? Their letters to one another are vital. What people said about the two of them together. There's a great and of course the disconnects between what people have said happened, what they said happened, what I think happened based on other reports, and to let the reader sort of, you know, there's tons of footnotes to sort of, you could retrace my steps and come hopefully to the same conclusions as I did. But really on the page, there's all these different interpretations. You know, their breakup, to give one example, Kiki says nothing about. She doesn't really even hardly mentions Man Ray in her own book. Man Ray says there were no scenes or explanations. It was, you know, big drama. She fell in with somebody else. And then we have Kay Boyle, you know, the great novelist, who said, oh yeah, I was out at the bar with Kiki and Man Ray came in and she threw her shoe at him and he had to crawl out on all fours under the swinging doors, and she was yelling and screaming at him the whole time, and there was throwing chairs and all that. So, you know, you've got these different versions of absent, you know, silence. Oh, it was far from dramatic. And then Kay Boyle's version, and, you know, the reader has to, and the historian has to kind of get at what might have really happened.
Yeah.
And I love that kind of stuff. It's
And also, I think there's an interesting thread between, you know, Just Kids, Normal People, and Kiki Man Ray around class and labor too, which, you know, is too often maybe a bit sublimated also in stories about history and artists and love. And so I really appreciated that. And I was wondering, just as we're celebrating here the paperback edition of this book, it's, you know, so it's been out in the world for a little while. Is there anything in, you know, conversations with, you know, with readers and, you know, giving book talks, has any sort of additional stories come up, or have you just come to think about a certain aspect of the book in a different way from the kind of first moment of it coming out into the world?
I think that, so first of all, there's been some really great participatory stuff where people send me like rare things, mostly to do with Man Ray. Like, have you seen this image?
Amazing.
Did you know this little tidbit? One of the things that I was sort of educated on, let's say in the past year, was I didn't realize I'd sort of made Man Ray a villain in a way that I hadn't, or the readers are reacting to, like, that, you know, that Man Ray is really a scoundrel. And look, his behavior is inexcusable. He's an abuser and does some horrible things. But I was and so that's good that people, you know, have responded to that with disgust, but also that, you know, I had thought that I was sort of balancing the two of them, and letting them speak for themselves. And that Man Ray would be sort of damning himself with his own words. And now I'm kind of realizing, no, you know, and I actually was rereading a little bit about it, which is hard to do, but I was rereading a bit of the book the other day, and I was like, no, I think I'm really on Kiki's side more than I thought so. And so that was a lesson that I think I can hopefully improve on for the next book, is that the authorial hand maybe can be a little bit lighter. You know, so that people can make their own decisions. And I do see little places where word choice, it's so, and you don't realize you're doing it. Maybe you have the same issue, right? With what you choose to put in and leave out in language, that you're sort of playing with these people who are real people who lived real lives. And so that was interesting, you know.
Even as, I mean, you know, the literature on Man Ray is so extensive, and obviously the literature on Kiki de Montparnasse is very not, and, you know, and your book does go such a long way in helping to bridge that gap too. So there's also the kind of, you know, historical chasms to take into account in terms of the authorial hand. But no, I really appreciate that answer. And only because you mentioned, you know, thinking about for the next book, I wondered if I could, you know, if we could, as a final question, and feel free to pass, as I know when I've been asked this question myself, it's always like a bit of a fraught one when you've just written a book. But I'm curious if you are working on another book project yet, and if so, if you feel comfortable sharing any part of it publicly, and if so, you know, do you see any sort of through lines or connections to Kiki Man Ray, and, you know, just what interests you in history or in telling a story?
Sure, thank you. I usually am very superstitious about talking about next projects, but I just happened to be right off the plane from Washington, D.C., where I was in the Library of Congress. So I'm on a high from playing archives. So
thanks.
I'd love to talk about it. In short, I'm writing about Janet Flanner, who wrote as Genet in the New Yorker. It was the New Yorker's first foreign correspondent, based, as you know, based in Paris. And I'm looking at her work in the 20s and especially in the 30s, in the run-up to the Second World War, where she sort of transitions from somebody who came to Paris to write about art and culture and ends up writing about Hitler and Mussolini and extremist politics. And so this idea of like what we do when the times change our entire job description and we sort of have to wake up to difficult political times, and how do you adjust? And I think she does it in quite an amazing way. So Flanner's at the center of the book. It's, again, we're back in Paris. It is in some ways actually a sequel to Kiki Man Ray, which I never thought I would do. But one of the things was quite heartbreaking in the course of the research for Kiki was to see all these people who are so free and so full of life and so unbounded by any kind of, societal constriction in the 20s. Then many of them meet terrible fates, in the 40s. Robert Desnos, who's a key player in this book, a poet who helped Kiki with her lyrics and was friends to her and Man Ray, is murdered in the Holocaust, and goes from this really outlandish, larger than life figure in the 20s to this horrible fate. And so, and it's shocking. How do you get from this open society to that in so short a time? And so I did want to say, well, now I've looked at the 20s, I should go and look at the 30s, really, and try to get at what has happened there and why. And so it's Paris in the 30s, which is really new and fascinating to me. And then Flanner was just somebody who gripped me while I was doing the Kiki research. She kept appearing because she was everywhere. She knew everyone, like Kiki, and everything she wrote was so smart and funny and witty and mean sometimes and caustic but insightful. And so I just kept going back to Flanner, and I was like, wow, this Flanner could really take over Kiki. I tried to sort of keep her on the margins, but I was like, well, there's the next book, because she's like Kiki, just one of these larger than life characters, and luckily has huge body of work to draw on. So I'm give me a few years, but that's where I'm.
Well, it sounds amazing. We'll try to be patient. In the meantime, we have hardcover and paperback of Kiki Man Ray, as well as your other titles to occupy our time. But thank you. It's really it's been so fun to chat with you about this book today.
Thank you, Prudence. I'm really honored to be speaking with you and to be doing this at City Lights, which to my mind, I think has the greatest and most comprehensive display of surrealist books, I think, of any bookstore I've ever seen. I think there's like a dedicated tower to it. So how fitting to be doing this with you at City Lights. And thank you to everybody else sharing this time with us.
Well, thank you both for this compelling and truly fascinating discussion. And Mark Braude, congratulations on the new paperback edition. It's wonderful. It's going to be able to reach a much, much larger audience. And Prudence Peiffer, thank you for doing the honors as interlocutor. It's been such a great conversation, and really an honor to have you both gracing our virtual halls. We have posted links in the event description with which those of you watching may purchase a copy of Kiki Man Ray, as well as the slip. Better yet, if you are in the hood, come on down, check out them in person, browse our stacks. That's what it's all about here at City Lights. We're located in San Francisco's historic North Beach district at the intersection of culture at Columbus and Broadway streets. We're open 7 days a week from 10 a.m. to 10 p.m., slowly getting back to our pre-pandemic hours. This broadcast has been made possible by support from the City Lights Foundation, continuing the legacy of our late founder, Lawrence Ferlinghetti, through public events like this one, our publishing program, and educational outreach, all dedicated to sustaining a vibrant community of readers, writers, and independent thinkers. So goodbye, everyone. Take care. We hope to see you again soon.